On this day, April 19th, in 1943, the first LSD trip took place. A few days earlier, on April 16th, Albert Hofmann was working in his chemistry laboratory. He was working on some extracts of the ergot fungus. This is a fungus that grows on rye, typically, and when ingested, it causes some strange hallucinations. There's some speculation that this is what caused the Salem witch trials, in which people started seeing witches and went a little loopy. But anyway, he was working on these chemicals in order to develop new heart drugs. But he accidentally dropped a beaker containing some of this chemical that he'd synthesized, and it broke, and it got all over the place. And he accidentally got some on his hands while he was trying to clean it up. And then he started feeling a little weird. He started having some lightheadedness and just kind of started feeling kind of funny. So being a scientist, of course, he was very curious about this. He was interested in why it was he was feeling strange and what this chemical might actually do if he ingested it. So he decided to, like all good scientists, do a self-experiment. So he decided to ingest a very small dose. He decided maybe about 150 micrograms. That seems like an insignificant dose. It couldn't possibly do all that much. So he prepares himself and takes this dose in a glass of water and then waits for a little while, and then everything starts going weird. The walls start to melt. Unfortunately, since this was the first LSD trip ever, what Albert Hofmann didn't know is that what he thought was a microdose was actually a pretty significant dose. This would be something closer to it's more than I would take on an average experiment, let's say that. Given his unfortunate state, he decided that he really needed to get home right then. And unfortunately, being wartime and he being in Austria, there was not much in the way of transportation available. So he had a bicycle. He hopped on his bike and went on a magical journey. The world started to melt into a sea of swirling color, and he was having a little difficulties on his bike. It was a pretty dramatic affair trying to get home. By the time he did get home, the drug was well into its full effects, and he was freaking out a little bit. He had the doctor come over and examine him, and other than an elevated heart rate, he seemed to be perfectly fine, physically at least. He was, though, seeing some scary stuff. He was confronting some of his inner demons, and certain things were kind of getting to him. But after a while, after he'd had a chance to chill out a bit, started listening to some decent music, went out into the garden, and it was beautiful. It was just absolutely gorgeous. Some of his visions were scary, but the other ones were quite terrific, just amazing, eye-opening. This marks just the first experiment, though, with this drug. Albert Hofmann would go on to experiment more with this drug, as would many others, and LSD became quite a thing. The psychiatric community throughout the mid and early 20th century really started to get on board with this idea. There were theories that it could approximate the effects of psychosis so that therapists could understand better what a psychotic patient was going through so that they could better help them. But then other things started to become possible. There's quite a bit of use in terms of dealing with childhood traumas, quite a bit of use in terms of unlocking neuroses and other issues that one might have that are intractable by other means. As a therapeutic tool, by either using a microdose or a macrodose and then going on a vision quest, this drug and others like it have made massive differences in people's lives. Unfortunately, though, the moral crusade of folks like Ronald Reagan and the moral panic that came along with the hippie generation and the vilification of the anti-war movement led to the war on drugs, which caused this drug to be swept up. And unfortunately, all sorts of, lies, misinformation were spread in order to vilify and make people afraid of psychedelic drugs generally. Fortunately, this is starting to change. We're in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. The effects of this drug and the uses that it can have, both therapeutic, recreational, medicinal, all sorts of different things, are becoming more well accepted among the scientific community and gaining much more acceptance in the general public eye. I, for one, am a huge advocate for LSD and psychedelics generally, as one of my most meaningful experiences of my entire life was an experience with psychedelics. I've had many others since then, and each one is equally as meaningful in one respect or another. It's truly unfortunate, the paternalistic attitude that our society has towards drug use, mind-altering drugs specifically. We have at our avail many, many different ways to alter our consciousness. And human beings have been altering our consciousness using drugs since before we were even human beings. There's a long tradition in both religious contexts, cultural contexts, as rites of passages, as coming-of-age ceremonies. This has been part of human culture for ages and ages and ages. And we have, as human beings, the right to participate in such things, to be able to alter our minds in whatever way we damn well choose, as long as it's not causing harm to those around us. And, of course, causing harm to those around us isn't really solved by criminalizing it. And unfortunately, that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And yes, this is changing as well. Cannabis in Ontario and in Canada has been legalized within the last few years, and that's a step in the right direction. Soon, I hope that psychedelics will also become legalized. Unfortunately, I worry that this is going to be purely in a medical context, in a professional context, as in there needs to be gatekeepers before you can get to this drug. Now, of course, we don't necessarily want absolutely everybody taking LSD or magic mushrooms or any other drug for that matter, because it's no laughing matter. It's not just a simple party drug. This thing can really fuck you up. If you're not ready for this and you're hit by a high-intensity trip, it can be extremely disorienting to the extent of having anxiety attacks. People get PTSD from having a bad acid trip, so you don't want to be walking into this blindly. But that doesn't get solved by prohibiting people entirely, nor does it get solved by putting it behind an official wall. More so, what we need is an adjustment to our cultural approach to mind-altering drugs. We need to be prepared for this sort of thing. We need to prepare other people who consider doing these sorts of drugs to be ready for what it entails. It's not something to be taken lightly, that's for sure. This is something that occupies a lot of my thinking, and I consider it actually my life's work. I think that including psychedelic drugs in our culture in a more broad context is a crucial factor in solving the shit we're in, really. We currently live with this worldview of possessive individualism, of non-interacting, discrete objects that don't really impact one another, when the reality is that we're all part of an intimately interconnected singular whole. And that's the major worldview shift that the psychedelic drug can bring on. If that experience were more common in our culture, I think it would be much easier to think in such a way as to be pro-social, pro-ecological, anti-selfish jerk face. Anyway, there's much more to be said on this at a later date. Thanks for watching. I make videos daily, and so if you like this content, check out some of those videos and do the algorithmic things, you know, all that sort of stuff. And I'll see you tomorrow.